On the day when the guards decided to pull the boots off his swollen feet, the flesh, soggy and peeling away from the bones, remained inside the worn-out leather, and the bones, stripped of muscle and tendon, slipped out with a soft, wet sound. Those present did not even have time to cross themselves before a hoarse, breathless chant of a psalm about the Last Judgment burst from his toothless mouth, which had not uttered a word in weeks. No one dared to admit aloud that the voice was not that of a living person, and that the king's lips were not moving at that moment. It all began several months earlier, at the end of a long winter, when the king still appeared at council and could sign decrees with his own hand. The court chronicler wrote that he began to complain of a dull pain in his legs, especially at night when he could not sleep, and demanded that his servant massage his feet with a hot cloth soaked in wormwood decoction. The doctors claimed that this was the result of an old wound sustained during the siege, but many of the courtiers whispered about the evil eye or punishment for the recent execution of the archbishop, which the king himself had ordered to be hastened without listening to the papal letters in their entirety. The first signs of the illness were hidden from the nobility and the people. Only trusted bodyguards, the chief physician, and 2 trusted monks were allowed into the king's chambers. They read prayers for his health, but at the same time made sure that his confession did not contain any words that could compromise his advisors. By spring, his legs began to turn black below the knees. Brown spots appeared on his skin, exuding a pungent smell of rot. The healers tried old methods. They applied leeches, performed bloodletting, and rubbed a thick ointment of resin and goat fat into his skin. But the tissue continued to decay, and gangrene spread upward. Rumors that could not be silenced said that during the night, vigils, hoarse chants could be heard coming from his bed. The monks on duty at the doors claimed that it was the king himself, although during the day he had already lost the ability to speak clearly. The guards were ordered not to let anyone in during the small hours, not even the heir. The court was in a state of hidden siege. The great nobles gathered in the side halls, discussing who would take power in the event of the king's death and who would fall out of favor with the new ruler. There was particular tension between the old nobility, who supported the alliance with the Catholic Church, and the supporters of recent reforms, who saw the monarch's illness as a sign of divine judgment. The chief physician wrote in his report that during the last examination, the skin on the king's feet was peeling off in layers and in places where the tissue had disappeared. Dry, brittle bones were visible. His pulse was weak and his breathing was uneven. On the advice of a monk healer, he was given opium tincture to ease his suffering, but the dose had to be increased every day. And by the end of the 3rd week, the pain had completely given way to immobile rigidity. Meanwhile, unrest was growing in the capital. Merchants complained that the currency was depreciating because the king had not approved new tariffs. Soldiers guarding the gates demanded their pay, but the treasury was closed to orders without the monarch's signature. The townspeople, seeing that no decrees were being issued, began to speculate. In the markets, people openly said that a state without a head was like a corpse without a heart, and that the rot eating away at the king's legs would spread to the whole kingdom. In the middle of spring, the disease entered a new stage. The king began to complain of coldness in his chest, even though his room was heated continuously. He fell into a stupor more and more often, from which he emerged with a plea for complete absolution. One of the priests close to him wrote, "He shook, clutching the cross, and said that he saw black figures behind the curtain of his bed. He said that they were singing, but not for him, but for the throne, which would soon be empty." After these words, access to him was even more restricted, for fear that his fears would be interpreted as a sign of the end. By the end of the month, his legs were completely blackened and exuded a foul odor that could not be concealed even with sandalwood and fragrant herbs. The physician, having received secret orders from the senior advisor, made a desperate attempt to save the monarch's life. He ordered the dead tissue to be cut away before the rot reached his thighs. Butchers were called in for this, as the court surgeons refused. The procedure took place at night, by torchlight, and was accompanied by groans that could be heard through 3 doors. The next morning, the courtiers were ordered to announce that the king was improving, even though he was unable to sit up on his own. But even when he was almost unconscious, fragments of prayers, sometimes whole lines of psalms, which did not correspond to the current readings, periodically came from his throat. This frightened both the priests and the ordinary servants. One of the later testimonies of Thomas's servant states, "I was holding a jug of water when he began to sing of the wrath of the Lord, and his voice became strange, as if 2 people were speaking, but his lips did not move." After the night when the butchers, suppressing their gagging, cut away the dead flesh, the smell in the chambers changed. It became not just heavy, but piercing, saturated with a sweetish rot that was not overpowered by incense or juniper fumigation. The windows were hardly ever opened, not so much because of the cold, as because of the senior advisor's orders. No one from the courtyard was to see that the king's bedroom was hung with tar-soaked rags, covering even the cracks in the doors. The servants who were allowed inside held rags soaked in vinegar under their noses, but many still fainted. Soon after the amputation, the wound began to ooze thick, greyish-yellow pus, and the entire lower part of the bed was covered with stains that had to be changed twice a day. The surgeon, who was called again, declared that gangrene had spread to the thighs and that help was now impossible. However, the advisors ordered him to remain silent to avoid panic. The healers limited themselves to applying bandages soaked in tar and crushed charcoal, and at night they gave him even stronger opium, after which he could no longer distinguish faces. Meanwhile, not only guards, but also armed men from various factions began to stand watch in the corridors leading to his chambers. The old nobility, loyal to the church, demanded that the king be confessed and given communion in the presence of the archbishop, fearing that without this, the heir would lose the support of the priests. Supporters of reform, on the contrary, tried to delay the moment, hoping that death, without proper rites, would weaken the influence of the Catholics and give them room to maneuver. The diary of one of the young scribes contains the following entry. "We no longer see the sovereign. Rumors contradict each other. Some say he is already dead and his body is being kept secret. Others say he is possessed and secret exorcists have been brought to him. Moans can be heard and sometimes singing that does not sound human." By the middle of summer, the king's face had changed beyond recognition. His cheeks were sunken, his lips were cracked, and his eyes, surrounded by black circles, looked like those of a feverish patient. The physician claimed that blood poisoning had set in and described the symptoms: continuous fever, delirium, and a rash on the chest and shoulders. He suggested another bloodletting, but the monks objected, believing that it would only hasten death. At night, his delirium became so severe that the guards at the door could hear him shouting the names of the people he had executed, ordering them to stand in line or bow their heads. Sometimes he cried out that they had come for him and demanded that a sword be brought to him. Meanwhile, the heir was strengthening his position. He collected signatures from nobles under oath of allegiance, promising to preserve their lands and positions. However, the widowed queen acted quietly. She met with representatives of the church and offered them new privileges in exchange for supporting her younger son as successor. Thus, a hidden struggle for the throne was taking place within the palace walls, in which the king's health became merely a pretext for manipulation. Servants said that in his last weeks, the king hardly opened his eyes. However, when a priest approached him with a cross, he would sometimes begin to quietly sing ancient church hymns as evenly and clearly as someone with diseased lungs and rotting feet could not. Those who heard this did not dare to repeat it, fearing that they would be accused of blasphemy or spreading panic. One night, when only the monk and the doctor were in the room, the king sat up in bed without assistance. Although he had been lying motionless for several days, he looked at them with cloudy eyes and said, "I hear trumpets outside the walls. They are calling to battle, but not for me." Then he lay down again and did not move until morning. The physician recorded this as a clear delusion caused by fever, but the monk insisted that it was a sign of the approaching end. Meanwhile, anxiety was growing in the city. Extra guards began patrolling the streets, fearing a riot. Bread doubled in price, and wine merchants began stocking up on barrels, anticipating that drunkenness and fighting would become commonplace during the days of mourning. Prophets began to appear on the outskirts, loudly proclaiming that the king's illness was punishment for the blood of the priests, and that with his death, fire would descend upon the earth. At the end of this part, despite the efforts of the advisors, it became clear that the illness could not be stopped. The purulent inflammation had reached the groin, the body had become swollen, and the skin was darkening and cracking in places. Strange chants continued to come from the depths of the palace, and more courtiers began to avoid approaching the royal chambers, believing that the very air there was dangerous. By the end of summer, the smell from the royal chambers was so bad that even the hardened guards, accustomed to the stench of death after battle, tried not to breathe as they passed by. A mixture of rot, old wine, and rancid fat seeped into the corridors, forcing those who lived in the neighboring halls to demand to be relocated. The windows in the bedroom were no longer opened. It was feared that the wind would spread the smell throughout the palace and cause rumors in the city. The floor where the servants walked was covered with several layers of rags to hide the stains showing through the mattress. The king's legs did not heal after amputation. Instead of clean wounds, there were deep, festering cavities in which, according to one of the surgeons, one could hide a fist. Pus flowed continuously, soaking the bandages, and each time they were changed, a wet rattle came from the wound, as if life was still smoldering deep inside the body, but in the disfigured tissues, it was already foreign. The fever remained constant. The skin on his face took on an earthy hue, and his eyes rolled back more and more often. The king hardly reacted to the presence of people, but at times he opened his mouth and began to sing, quietly but evenly, with a tone and intonation more reminiscent of a monastery choir than a sick man. The doctors tried to explain this as a mechanical habit or remnants of consciousness, but the monks whispered that it was not his soul speaking. During these same weeks, an open struggle for the throne unfolded in the corridors of the palace. The heir, having secured the support of several influential commanders of the guard, demanded to be allowed to see his father in order to announce his future coronation in the presence of witnesses. The widowed queen categorically opposed this, stating that according to the laws, the throne should pass to the younger son until the older one was recognized by the church. Both camps began to attract priests to their side, promising them land and income. A report from one of the city officials stated bluntly, "The top brass of the guard is divided, with some officers receiving their pay from the heir and others from the queen. This creates the danger of armed conflict within the palace." The advisors tried to smooth over the conflict, but it was clear that the king's death would be the signal for decisive action. The monarch's condition worsened with each passing day. Dark spots appeared on his stomach and chest, a sign of the beginning of internal organ failure. His breathing became wheezy, and a faint gurgling sound could be heard with each exhalation. The physician confessed to his closest confidant that, even with the most gracious providence, the king would not live to see winter. Despite this, the isolation continued. No more than 3 people were allowed into the chambers at a time, and only with the permission of the senior advisor. Even the heir saw his father only once during his entire illness. During this brief meeting, according to eyewitnesses, the king did not recognize him and asked, "Who is this monk and why has he brought a sword?" Although there were no weapons in the room, the city was in a state of anticipation. Rumors spread in the markets that the palace was hiding not a living person, but a dead body, to which monks recited psalms at night to conceal the death, until the agreements on the succession to the throne were finalized. Others claimed that the king had witnessed heavenly signs and was refusing to die, clinging to power even in his unconscious state. In early autumn, an incident occurred that shook the entire court. A servant, changing a bandage, accidentally pulled off a piece of dead tissue, revealing an empty space with a bone visible beneath it. When touched, it broke off like a dry twig. The king did not utter a sound, but after a few moments, he began to quietly recite a line from a psalm about the coming of judgment, and his voice was clear as if he were a man in perfect health. The monk who was in the room ran out without waiting for him to finish. This scene was a turning point. Even the most stubborn advisors realized that it was no longer possible to hide the sovereign's condition. Secret negotiations began on the timing of the announcement of mourning and the order of the transfer of power. However, there was still time before the official announcement, and it was becoming increasingly dangerous. Armed men were gathering within the palace walls, each faction preparing for the death to be announced at a moment convenient for them. In the fall, when the nights grew colder, the temperature in the king's chambers remained unnaturally high due to his constant fever. The fireplace was kept burning day and night at the insistence of the doctors, but the heat came not so much from the fire as from the patient himself. The physician wrote in his report, "The skin is hot to the touch, but there is no elasticity under the fingers. It is like soft wax. When pressed lightly, deep indentations remain. that take a long time to smooth out. The swelling spread to the entire body. The face was so swollen that the eyes became narrow slits, and the eyelids often stuck together from secretions. The mouth was often slightly open, and a viscous liquid accumulated in it, which the servants scooped out with a spoon so that he would not choke. In between periods of unconsciousness, the king sometimes moved his lips, but most often these were not words, but fragments of prayers and psalms that he seemed to utter in a voice that was not his own. The wounds on his legs turned into gaping blackened holes from which a putrid vapor emanated. When the servants changed the bandages, the stench was so strong that they lost their appetite for a long time and complained of dizziness. The doctor, trying with all his might to stop the decay, ordered the wounds to be sprinkled with crushed charcoal and poured over with a decoction of St. John's wort, but the gangrene had already risen above the groin. At that time, the courtyard turned into a field of silent war. Supporters of the heir began to appear openly with armed guards, while supporters of the younger son took up positions inside and effectively blocked access to the royal chambers. Several officers of the guard went missing, and rumors spread that they had been secretly removed to prevent information from leaking out. The widowed queen insisted that the archbishop be brought to the dying king, but advisors from the heir's camp forbade it, fearing that he would change the will. The archbishop came anyway, but he was only allowed in after he swore to keep silent about everything he saw. According to him, the king did not recognize him. But when he began to read the prayer, he suddenly began to howl in time with the words, and this howl was like the singing of a choir, but without words, just a long, drawn-out sound. No one in the city doubted that the end was near. Merchants closed their shops earlier than usual, fearing looting. People gathered in the markets, discussing who would be the first to seize power. They said that as soon as the death was announced, a massacre would begin in the capital between the supporters of different pretenders. On the eve of the final crisis, the guards on duty at the bedroom door reported a strange phenomenon. A few hours before dawn, singing could be heard coming from the chambers, in which several voices could be heard at once. One was muffled and low, another high and clear, and the third sounded like a woman's. All three sang the same psalm, but at different rhythms. Inside, there was only the king and two servants, who swore they had not opened their mouths. By morning, the king's fever had risen so high that yellow moisture appeared on the sheets and his body became sticky. His pulse was barely detectable, and his breathing became rare and wheezy. Realizing that death would come in the next few days, the physician called for a priest, but was refused by the advisors, who were still trying to buy time. By evening, one of the butchers who was helping with the bandaging noticed that the skin on the king's stomach was beginning to crack, revealing dark, moist patches. The stench was so bad that people in the corridor moved dozens of steps away. Despite this, the king suddenly opened his eyes and, without moving his lips, began to utter words about impending retribution and a great battle for the throne. After which, he sank back into unconsciousness. At that moment, cries rang out from the neighboring halls. Two guards had clashed in an attempt to break through to the king's chambers. The court was in a state of open conflict, and everyone understood that the king's death was a matter of hours, not weeks. Death overtook him in the middle of the night, while outside the palace walls, the deafening commotion between the guards continued. Several candles burned in the chambers, their flames barely flickering in the heavy, still air. The physician on duty at the bedside noted that his breathing had become so rare that 10 heartbeats passed between each breath. At the last moment, the king opened his eyes, but his gaze was not fixed on the people in the room, but somewhere above, at the dark beams of the ceiling. He did not move his lips, but a long psalm sounded in his throat, even and clear, as if sung by a healthy man in a monastery choir. The sound lasted for a few moments, then stopped, and his chest did not rise again. The doctor cautiously brought his hand to his mouth and nose, then crossed himself. The monk next to him said a prayer, but the advisor who was present immediately ordered that no one speak of death. It was decided to announce it only when one of the factions had won, to avoid an immediate outbreak of violence. They began to prepare the body for embalming, but after a few minutes, it became clear that this would be almost impossible. The skin on his stomach and chest was torn from touching, and his insides gave off a stench that neither incense nor tar could mask. Surgeons called in during the night worked in masks soaked in vinegar, but many still had to step away from the window, choking on the stench. One of the secret reports sent to a foreign ambassador that day said, "The sovereign died at an hour when darkness was thick and heavy. His advisors concealed his death, but the smell cannot be contained. And now the entire palace breathes the air of a tomb." A few hours later, the guards at key posts began to be replaced. Supporters of the heir attempted to seize control of the halls leading to the throne room. In response, the widowed queen's men blocked the inner gates, leaving only a narrow passage that could be defended. The first skirmishes took place in the east wing. 3 guards were killed and 5 more were seriously wounded. Meanwhile, work continued on the body in the chambers. Carpenters hastily constructed a special coffin lined with lead to keep the smell in, but even through the thick walls, the stench was palpable. Monks recited prayers, but many of them hurried to finish the service and leave, unable to bear the stench and the sight of the decomposing flesh. The announcement of his death came only 2 days later. The heir appeared before the people, accompanied by armed guards and the archbishop, holding the royal ring in his hands. The crowd gathered at the palace greeted the news with a deafening roar. Some people crossed themselves in silence, while others shouted about signs and punishment. On the same day, looting began on the outskirts of the capital. Armed gangs disguised in mourning broke into merchants' houses. Political chaos developed rapidly. The senior nobility demanded the immediate coronation of the heir, but supporters of the younger son refused to recognize it as legitimate, pointing out that the will had not been read in the presence of witnesses. Disagreements arose in the church. Some priests claimed that death without confession had deprived the king of salvation, while others claimed that he had received forgiveness in his last moments. Within a week, the capital was plunged into a state of constant tension. At night, shots and the clang of weapons could be heard, and armed troops patrolled the streets, not always obeying a single authority. Letters sent by foreign ambassadors during those days repeated the same idea. The death of the sovereign was the spark that ignited everything that had been building up for years: hatred, fear, and greed. The funeral was held in private, with no public access to the body. The coffin was brought out only briefly, covered with black cloth. Many were convinced that inside was not the king's body at all, but lid plates to hide his condition. After the burial, rumors of nighttime psalms that allegedly continued to sound in his empty chambers only intensified. Thus ended his long and painful departure. A death hidden for the sake of power turned into a rift that could no longer be repaired. The country, which only yesterday had a single ruler, now belonged to no one and everyone at once. And those who remembered the smell of decay in the palace walls said that it would not fade for many years to come.